Adesso la nostra ultima panelist, Lucia Pietroiusti. Lucia Pietroiusti è curatrice del progetto General Ecology alle Serpentine Galleries di Londra, nonché curatrice di Sun and Sea Marina, il padiglione lituano vincitore del Leone d'Oro alla 58esima Biennale d'Arte di Venezia 2019. Perdonami Lucia, non provo a nominare gli artisti, lo farai tu perché ho provato più volte a leggerlo ma... insieme a Filipa Ramos ha co-curato il festival, che è un festival ongoing da quello che ho capito, una serie di incontri che continua, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, sulla coscienza interspecista. I suoi ambiti di ricerca includono il posthumanesimo, l'ecologia, la coscienza interspecista, l'estinzione delle specie viventi, l'intelligenza delle piante, la botanica e la mitologia. E Lucia Pietroiusti ci parlerà di come l'ecologia possa diventare un modello anche per fare cultura, per vivere l'istituzione in modo diverso, per parlare di arte, nel suo intervento nel sottobosco del sottobosco. Grazie, prego Lucia.
Non vi vedo, buonasera, ciao, grazie Giovanna, grazie Daniel per gli inviti, grazie a Giulia, Matteo, tutti del team per tutto, ovviamente Lucia Fiammetta anche per la curatela della mostra. Dunque, io comincio con una scusa. Siccome in italiano, siccome è esattamente la metà della mia vita che vivo in un paese anglofono, e in italiano ci parlo solo con Filippa, con cui non abbiamo neanche bisogno di finire le frasi perché telepatia, e con mio figlio che ha 2 anni, purtroppo mi manca il linguaggio per riuscire a fare questa lecture appunto in italiano, quindi la faccio in inglese. Voi spero che mi perdonate e vabbè, al massimo urlate se non c'è niente da capire, se non si capisce nulla. Dunque, altra premessa che ti volevo ringraziare Emanuele che avevi parlato di questa cosa, perché io il giorno che mi sono resa conto che quando muoio verrò mangiata da un albero sono stata felicissima e vi invito tutti a meditare moltissimo su questa cosa perché quindi... allora, mi chiamo Lucia, sono Curator of General Ecology come ha detto Giovanna a Serpentine Galleries a Londra. E adesso tutto il resto lo so dire solo in inglese. I will start with a few things that art, poetry, imagination, where's the clicker? That art, poetry, imagination in general can help with in the real world. And then move on to a few projects that I've recently worked on or am currently working on. So, a few things that we are really, really, really good at in the arts. Fictions. So, in the late 1980s in Maryland, a restaurant would be responsible for an additional tax called amusement tax if it provided live performance entertainment to its customers, so live concerts. In 1986, the state of Maryland took on the Chuck E. Cheese chain, pizza chain, arguing that its music-playing, animatronic, anthropomorphic animal robots were in fact live performers. The court ruled against this suggestion, and here is the court's decision. Quote, a pre-programmed robot can perform a menial task, but because a pre-programmed robot has no skill and therefore leaves no room for spontaneous human flaw in an exhibition, it cannot perform a piece of music. In other words, the Chuck E. Cheese band cannot make mistakes and cannot develop skills, so it is not live. This case is part of an ongoing research-based artwork by artists Ben and Sebastian for an old library in Aarhus in Denmark, and which will soon be converted to a family court. And in a recent conversation, in fact, yesterday, otherwise I wouldn't have known where to start with this lecture. In fact, yesterday we spoke about the progressive degradation of these animatronic beings. In the end, in 2017, all of these animatronic robots were taken out of service. And we spoke of their malfunction as a kind of decreasing skill and a set of error. So all of a sudden, all the boundaries are not exactly where we thought they were in the first place. Ecocide. invited to present case files for an international law case about a dramatic case of forest fires that were ignited in Indonesia in 2015, the group of researchers and artists called Forensic Architecture began to look into the possible legal frameworks and fictions within which such an act could be serious enough to be tried in an international court. The fires, which were connected to deforestation for the purposes of oil palm plantation and were the products of a collaboration between government and international agro-business, resulted in not a lot of human deaths, but the displacement or death of an enormous amount of orangutans. Through reflecting on a kind of fuzzy and unstable historical boundary in case studies between human and non-humans, the artwork posited the fires, the artwork and in fact the case filed made the case for these fires being murder rather than crime. Offsetted. In their exhibition and performance project called Offsetted, the spatial practitioners' cooking sections turned their attention to the way in which New York City trees are turned into quantifiable financial assets through the practice of carbon offsetting. E questo lo sappiamo, si pagano €2 in più e si può prendere un volo per non so cosa. Doesn't work anyway. Within such an ecological economic system, over 678,000 trees provide more than $100 million worth of environmental services per year. A critique of the financialization of the environment, as opposed to, say, the reduction of emissions, the project reflected on the personhood of trees, proposing legal strategies for the trees to bring into reality their rights, not to serve as carbon offsets, allowing to just be trees. Other things we're really, really good at. So, in 2018, as Giovanna said already twice during this evening, together with Filipa, we began to prepare an interdisciplinary Symposium series which would bring together artists, anthropologists, scientists, and musicians around the question of consciousness in a more than human landscape. We called this The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, and I will briefly pause to tell you a little bit about where that title came from, and about this title as a kind of meeting point of this circle, the material, actual, sandy thing that is the circle itself, and the symbolical representational extrapolation that emerged as in the series of events. So this is a scene from Blue Planet. Most of you will probably at this point have seen this circle. If you haven't, it's amazing. The fish is so tiny that you can hardly see it in the center in a kind of cloud of sand. Now, the cool thing about this is that the pufferfish is like this. The circle is huge. When you see it from the top down, you go, oh, it's a beautiful artwork. Beautiful, it's a drawing by fish, it means the fish can make artwork, blah, blah, blah. David Attenborough says, oh, it's a mating rituals, it's so lady pufferfish will come and make puffer babies. Either way, we started to really think about like that tiny fish in the context of what it needed to do to start to make this thing happen, right? And what it needed to do was less a kind of this, or a kind of this, or a kind of, and more of a kind of, like a dance or a shuffle, if you like. And so we started to think about how does the fish imagine this circle before it is made? Does the fish really have this kind of top-down viewpoints of all the previous pufferfish circles and go, oh, I really want to make one in that style? Or is it more a kind of in the middle of or right next to? And so is a viewpoint that is in the middle of, so a viewpoint that acknowledges the utter and total immersion of the human self with all of its abstractions and metaphors and beautiful systems of representations and anthropocentric notions of literature, generosity, whatever. Is this middle, in the middle of viewpoint, maybe a necessary prerequisite for the development of a deep ecological sense of self, and how does that then translate into programming or curatorial practice? Also, what are the conditions of possibility that make a dance, like a seduction strategy, a mound of sand, a geometrical figure, a mathematical formula, a fractal maybe, and an artwork so adherent to one another that they might reveal themselves to in fact be one and the same. And so how to look at something like the intersections between the disciplines themselves in a kind of fuzzy enough way, to look at those intersections between the disciplines, as the architect Keller Easterling says, with half-closed eyes, in a fuzzy enough way, so that you encounter similarity much, much, much earlier than you encounter differentiation. So similarity of idea, synchronicity of idea, alliances between ideas before you find the specificities that differentiate you. And of course, we had a Skype recently where we were accused of being really, really unacademic and rigorous, but I think that's fine. I think that's part of the intention, is to look at things in a slightly blurry way. So we take, through the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish, we take one idea at a time, and that comes from an anthropocentric view of the world, and we just slowly just throw some bits out until it doesn't exist anymore. The first one was language, the idea that you needed a symbolic representational system to communicate, and by the end of the night, I think we all felt that language was nothing more than being with together. The second one, which we did half a year later, had to do with oneness and selfhood, the idea that when I say I am a single being separate from others, when in fact I am myself an enormous, exuberant contradiction of enormous number of beings that in fact collaborate for me to feel even mildly happy in the morning. The third event, which was in May, was to do with really the fact of plants having become this kind of backdrop against which animal consciousness, animal studies, and human thinking existed. And we really started to think about the intelligence of plants and also communications with the vegetal world. So in what kinds of states of mind one is able to really listen to what plants have to say, as it were. And we're looking at other things like chanting. Like if you say to yourself, okay, chanting is not only a human thing and not only a bird thing, this is really in the works, so I don't know. We're thinking about it. But if you decide to say, okay, let's de-anthropocentric the notion of chanting, so repetitive song, for the purposes of some kind of meditative state, then how does a forest chant? I suppose we've heard actually quite a few forest chants today, but anyway, so maybe we don't need to do that one. So the other metaphor, no, that's another fish. That's just what they look like, because we don't do this at the Serpentine. We just show you a nice image of this, and then we do that. So plant sex, last April, as a spin-off to The Shape of a Circle, Filipa and I and Kostas Stasinopoulos from the Serpentine curated Plant Sex, which was a much more perhaps artist-driven or artist-led event looking at erotics and botany, and in fact Emanuele was one of our participants. So part of the exercise here was to travel back to travel back to very early metaphorical abstraction, as in very early poetry, and bring them back together with that knowledge of plants and agriculture that those works hold within them, that they conserve like an archive and passed on to future generations. But over the generations, those things become known as myths and become known as metaphorical abstractions. So to make a very clear and rather erotic example, because it's late at night, almost, I will read just a couple of excerpts. That is saffron, and that I think is an Inanna, or it's a Neolithic goddess of which both has a plant and a vagina in the same. So the Song of Song, Il Cantico dei Cantici. Song of Songs, this is a small note, follows in the tradition of erotic celebrations of love and marriage. The young girl and her lover, often identified as King Solomon, are in a garden. Here, lovemaking is entangled with the perfumes, textures, and seductiveness of plants, but the other way around is equally intriguing. In the last passage, the king, comparing the girl to a palm tree, refers to the process of date tree fertilization, an agricultural practice which may date as far back as the 5th or 6th century. So, she says, "And my beloved among the young men is a branching apricot tree in the wood. In that shade I have often lingered, tasting the fruit. Now he has brought me to the house of wine, and his flag over me is love. Let me lie among vine blossoms in a bed of apricots. I am in the fever of love. His left hand beneath my head, his right arm holding me close. Daughters of Jerusalem, swear to me by the gazelles, by the deer in the field, that you will never awaken love until it is ripe. He says, that day you seemed to me a tall palm tree, and your breasts the clusters of its fruit. I said in my heart, let me climb into that palm tree and take hold of its branches. And oh, may your breasts be like clusters of grapes on a vine, the scent of your breath like apricots, your mouth like good wine. The next one is Sumerian poetry, and specifically the myth of Inanna. The myth of Inanna dates back to around 3,500 before Christ, or even earlier, and they associate the goddess Inanna with fertility, agriculture, and trees. And in this passage, and this passage is so much fun, Inanna has married Dumuzi, the shepherd. What follows brings together the sexual act and the agricultural fertility ritual. So Inanna says, my vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? Cioè, chi ararerà la mia vulva, chi ararerà il mio, come si dice, ground? Il mio terreno bagnato. E Dumuzi risponde, great lady, the king will plow your vulva. I, Dumuzi, the king, will plow your vulva. E Inanna risponde, then plow my vulva, man of my heart, plow my vulva. And Inanna risponde, he has sprouted, he has burgeoned, he is lettuce planted by the water. He is the one my womb loves best. He brought me into his garden. My brother Dumuzi brought me into his garden. I strolled with him among the standing trees. I stood with him among the fallen trees. By an apple tree I knelt, as is proper, before my brother coming in song, who rose to me out of the poplar leaves, who came to me in the midday heat. Before my lord Dumuzi, I poured out plants from my womb. I placed plants before him. I poured out plants before him. I placed grain before him. I poured out grain before him. I poured out grain from my womb. So a little passage on the sand itself. For the Venice Biennale this year, I curated the Lithuanian Pavilion, which presented the work Sun and Sea by 3 Lithuanian artists whose names are Rugilė Barzdžiukaitė, Vaiva, Grainytė, and Lina, Lapelytė. And the work, which you can see here, is an opera performance that you see from above. And the vacationers on the sandy, indoor, artificially lit beach are singers, but there are also kids and dogs and games and food and occasionally mice. And they do what they want to do on the beach, with the exception of the music itself, which presents the everyday thoughts, chats, and preoccupations of holiday goers, as you might find if you could snapshot the inner monologue going on inside those people at any given time. And these thoughts that they have, these songs, over time grow to reveal a thin veil of climate anxiety, and the piece has been read mostly as a comment on inaction in the face of inconceivable catastrophe. And so today I wanted to speak of maybe a few things. The sand itself, the military, and why I think people have been quite moved when they've gone to physically see the work in the space. So we wanted to do a work in and with the city of Venice that went beyond the presentation of the performance. So there's a few things that the pavilion did that were perhaps invisible to the audience member that would have just gone to see the opera, but that we felt were significant in relation to kind of really taking account of and taking responsibility for its position and relationships with the city of Venice. So the first thing was to have a small military invasion of a military zone. This is military zone. It's not the Arsenale that the Biennale is in, not the like nice Arsenale that you pay a ticket to go get in. This is like behind the military walls. And opening up this area to the public had never been done by the military before. So you had these very interesting situations. We were kind of in a constant game of chess with the military where the rules change all the time. And because they're the militaries, they're the ones that make the rules, and we're the ones that have to somehow stick by them. So one day the fence is over here, and one day the fence has to move over here, and the other day the colonnello says that the kids were playing in the football field, and so they've going to close our toilets. That happened, and the toilets never reopened until the end. One day you've got like colonnello in uniforme walking this way, bikini walks in the other direction, and you kind of go, well, it's really interesting if you think about that really famous image about the hippie sort of flower against the gun thing, and it's like bikini, and I don't know, there was something really interesting that ended up kind of happening at symbolic level about this like very small sort of invasion of the absurd into a space. The sand itself, the sand was imprinted with the months that felt the performance's presence. And we really thought about how to take account for the sand in a city that, where you can't just put things anywhere you like. And as a result, the sand itself, which ended up being the ground that registered the presence of all these kids and all these performers, is becoming how do you say, mo in francese mi viene, bac à sable, playgrounds, basically playgrounds for children. The city of Venice opened 2 new playgrounds. I don't know if they're still here after the Acqua Alta, but 2 new playgrounds for children with the sand that originally came from Lithuania in a truck. So, blah, blah, blah. Then the tears. I suppose we should probably talk about the fact that the piece was described as a very moving piece. So if you haven't experienced it, I think I need to clear out a few misunderstandings. It was very mysterious to us that so many people, and I really mean so many people, cried when they came to see this. And that's because Sun and Sea Marina is anything, but it's not manipulative. The music is extremely minimal. The libretto verges on the absurd. It's almost funny. And the scenography, this idea of watching from above, does the exact opposite of what you might imagine or what sort of VR gives you the experience or the potential of doing, which is this kind of empathy work through being in the middle of. It alienates you from it completely by putting you a few meters above something that should otherwise be completely familiar to you. A holiday at the beach. And somehow I feel that it was exactly this very matter-of-factness, this very there-ness that ended up being so touching to the audience. Seeing life itself just picked up, and delicately placed on a stage with no trim, no nothing. Just kids, dogs, packed lunches, bananas, towels, badminton. And sometimes I think it makes people cry in the way that you might cry the day your kid is packing their bags to move to university. You just realize that life is just like that, and that feeling can be quite overwhelming. Of course, there's the other layer of the piece. First of all, it goes on forever. The performance has no beginning and no end. You simply wander into this space, and you decide when to leave. And so this idea of these people on the beach that sing on a loop forever is really anxiety-producing, but maybe just to us, the organizers. And then, of course, there is the climate message. And there again, it's probably actually moving not because it's about a catastrophe or because it's accusing you, but rather because one realizes what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence of climate change and climate disaster. The creaking, slow-moving, tectonic nature of this particular disaster. A disaster that may be wreaking havoc in 2 seconds through a tornado halfway across the world while we, on a beach, play badminton. So you see the cognitive dissonance. The piece doesn't really point at a kind of judgmental figure at you, you who are holding that racket in the hand, but it just says, look. Look. And so you look. I'm just gonna... Giulia, can you play this? Grazie.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118,
let's say that that is the most manipulative part of the whole opera. So it's really not so much. It's really not a kind of Hollywood movie version of climate change. In fact, the artist would probably yell at me for putting this dead fish on the screen. Okay. In 2017, I had a baby. And that baby taught me at least 3 things. 1, interspecies communication. 2, how to think beyond the lifespan of one human life and start to take responsibility over a scale that is not exactly the scale of one human life. So even though we're talking about just maybe another 50 years of life, it still at least makes the point that the scale of the lifetime within which I had previously chosen to take accountability and responsibility for was not the only. It sort of relativized and perspectivized that sense of time. And then the third thing has a lot to do with yeast and with what Emanuele talked about. And so I won't go into it, but something along the lines of, e poi ogni volta che faccio le lectures in inglese devo dire, perché in italiano il lievito si chiama madre, tu prendi un pezzo e poi ci fai un pezzo di pane, quello cresce, poi ne prendi un altro pezzo, e quindi siamo così, esattamente così, ma comunque Emanuele vi ha detto tutto, quindi. Kind of during the time of maternity, because of the fact that I tend to sort of hyperthink experience, and therefore I wasn't just like, oh, that's kind of cute, baby, or I can't sleep, but rather was like, what does this all mean? I wrote a project called General Ecology that followed from earlier research about ecology and the environment that, at least for me, had begun with a festival that we called the Extinction Marathon, that we had organized at the Serpentine Galleries together with the artist Gustav Metzger. But anyways, the basic idea for general ecology even, was to reach the infrastructure of the institution via the medium of the curatorial, in order to embed ecological principles, research, subject matters, and methodologies throughout the whole of the galleries. So we began with the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish with Filipa, and I have to say that this series is still ongoing and that it underpins much of the rest of the work. In late 2018, the General Ecology project kind of existed maybe like unofficially for about half a year. I made the case to the Serpentine that to demonstrate a true commitment to the environment, a department for it needed to be established. And it doesn't matter that we're a contemporary art institution, maybe we can have an ecology department. And that is what we did. Today, the General Ecology project looks at weaving environmental questions and concerns across exhibitions, live programs, publications, radio, and so much more. But also it works with partners and organizations to establish new ways of working together based on ecological principles, such as cooperation and symbiosis. In essence, the work hovers between ecology as a theme and ecology as a way of seeing. As far as the work with the public is concerned, I'm really, really trying, and this is what we're trying with the Ecology project, to in a really interdisciplinary and always artist-led and artist-driven way, to present alternative worldviews that hold a non-anthropocentric view of ourselves and our environments, as well as strong commitments to do with climate peace, climate justice, ethics, rights, biodiversity, and plant intelligence. No. So it was really about trying, we started to become interested in the magic spell. Something that as you say something does something, like a yes when you're in a wedding ceremony. Judith Butler calls it the performative. I like the idea of a magic spell. So the idea was really, can the methodology, could we say something, and by saying something, provoke a kind of change underneath to the structure that hold it up? In other words, could the methodology be adherent to the subject matter? So I guess the way that I would say it is like working like a parasite on parasites, working like a mushroom on mushrooms, and then trying to also work out like what that actually means, because sometimes we say it and we're like, yeah, but really, what does that mean? You know, we try and do sort of collaborative work, partner organizations, kind of sharing of resources, thinking of things that can live together. We just hold the I guess, methodologies and methods of the ecological firmly in our minds as a kind of guiding principle for a certain kind of affect, maybe, that gets poured into the work. So, if the project's success may have been considered to be embedding ecological principles throughout the whole of the gallery's outputs and infrastructure, then I suppose there's a kind of success on the horizon, because I will now tell you a little bit about one of the main things I'll be working on over the next year, which is the 50th anniversary program of the Serpentine, which will weave the ecological throughout everything else that we're doing, which is obviously really exciting for me. But it really began from something that I find incredibly irritating, and that is when people talk about the risk of extinction and the risk of catastrophe, without acknowledging the fact that those extinctions and those catastrophes are always already happening, and in fact have been happening for centuries, somewhere else from where we stand. And this is my least favorite thing of all, people who design things like floating cities, because I'm sorry, now I'm going to get really angry. If you might be working on these things, and your public might be hailing you as some kind of a climate hero because you have these floating, community gardens filled, hydroponics, vegetarian, bamboo constructed, I'm making no names, cities. And then you go, well, hopefully there will be for everyone. And I'm sorry, no, that's not true. And the thing that I feel like when I'm sitting in those audiences is those people that we call heroes, the people that feel themselves to be the heroes of this, are actually making the technical, cognitive, and political labor on behalf of the uber rich who are going to be able to afford them. And that doesn't include any of us. Any of us. All the people who are going to be on the hydroponic, like Lonely Island dream, are none of us, including the people who are designing them. So I always think when you're working with the environment, be very careful about who you're working for and who your client is. Not only from a kind of like literally who's paying you, but also like, how can you work for them? Or them? Well, I guess, or them. How can you work for them? Or try really hard to work for them. So anyway, long story short, and in the last minute that I have, I will tell you about Back to Earth. So as I said, it's the 50th anniversary program for 2020 and beyond, which a little bit like a generalization of the general ecology project itself, will address ecology throughout every strand of our programs. So rather than celebrating escape strategies from Earth reserved from the few, it roots firmly in the messy and complex realities of the ground in which we walk, and that's why it's called Back to Earth. We are working on artist-led initiatives and campaigns that directly respond to the environment with projects that are both artworks and methodologies or prototypes, and they will be at once poetic, ritualistic, impassioned, and hopefully also useful and generative, and all those things at once with no contradiction. At the same time as we're doing this, we're also thinking about the internal transformation of the way we work together and with others, and of forms of methods sharing. So how do we open source the way that we're doing, not only as a thing that we do, but also as a methodology by which we have done it? It's a very complex project, and many parts of it might not be immediately visible. Like a garden, and we like to think of it in a kind of permacultural way, the individual initiatives might pop up at some point throughout the year, not pop up at all for the whole year, be latent, and then emerge, gestate, flower at different points of the months and the years. And at the same time, we're kind of using a sort of regular narrative strand through the medium of podcast to try and think about what ecological practice means in relation to all this. As a result, Back to Earth is both a program about change and a catalyst for change. And much like the climate crisis itself, it's a complex web of interconnected, well, not the climate crisis, much more like responses to the climate crisis itself, themselves. Back to Earth is a complex web of interconnected research, interventions, and activities. It asks, what new ecosystems can foster agency within ecosystems? What kind of research sharing, resource sharing, and collaborative working practices are necessary to present complex responses to complex problems? And I should really say that in honor of that, this is a collaborative project that involves an enormous number of people within the institution, certainly not just myself. So in the current environmental emergency, Back to Earth advocates for the implementation of small, incremental, and transformative shifts, both within the galleries themselves and outside of it, to operationalize what the activities of an art institution are towards the efforts of environmental causes, climate peace, and climate justice. I think I'm going to close with 2 quotes that the whole team of Back to Earth is particularly fond of. So one, Bruno Latour from Down to Earth: when the rug is pulled out from under your feet, you understand at once that you are going to have to be concerned with the floor. And the second one, although I slightly disagree with the fact of using the metaphor of killing weeds as the kind of problem solving, but nevertheless, Keller Easterling: the activist doesn't need to face off against every weed in the field, but rather, unannounced, alter the chemistry of the soil. Thank you.